Welcome to the fog hut.
I never thought a simple ornament could change my life. Christmas was supposed to be about joy, warmth, and family, but that year, everything was different. It began innocently enough, with the arrival of old Mr. Hargrove, our eccentric neighbor, and a peculiar gift that would haunt me forever. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. The air outside was crisp, and the ground was blanketed in fresh snow. I had just returned from the store, my arms full of groceries, when I noticed Mr. Hargrove standing at the edge of our driveway. He looked frail, bundled in his oversized coat and scarf, but his eyes were sharp and focused on me. In his hands, he held a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. "Ah, young man," he called, his voice raspy but steady. "I've been meaning to see you." I smiled politely, though I'll admit I was in a hurry to get inside. "Hello, Mr. Hargrove. Everything all right?" He shuffled closer, extending the box toward me. "I came across this at the antique shop downtown. Thought it might suit your tree." I hesitated. Mr. Hargrove was known for his odd gifts. Last year, he'd given us a stack of old books, half of them falling apart. But there was something about the way he held the box, almost reverently, that piqued my curiosity. "That's very kind of you," I said, taking the package. It was surprisingly light. "You didn't have to." He smiled, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nothing. Just an old ornament. Thought it deserved a new home." Before I could respond, he turned and shuffled away, leaving me standing in the snow with the box in my hands. Later that evening, as my wife Claire and I decorated the tree, I remembered the box. It had been sitting on the counter all afternoon, untouched. I retrieved it and brought it into the living room, setting it on the coffee table as Claire adjusted the lights on the tree. "What's that?" she asked, glancing at the box. "A gift from Mr. Hargrove," I said, tearing away the paper. Inside was a small, glass ornament. It was delicate, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. The glass caught the light, casting faint, shifting patterns on the walls. "It's beautiful," Claire said, stepping closer. "Almost looks handmade." I nodded, holding it up. The patterns seemed to shift as I turned it, almost like they were alive. "He said he found it at an antique shop." "Well, let's find it a place on the tree," Claire said, smiling. "It'll add some charm to our collection." I hung the ornament near the center of the tree, where the lights would catch it just right. It looked perfect there, nestled among the other decorations. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, as if the ornament belonged there. That night, I had the first dream. It began innocently enough. I was in a field, surrounded by tall grass swaying in the wind. The sun was warm on my skin, and the sky was a brilliant shade of blue. But then the scene shifted. The grass turned dark, withered, and brittle. The sky grew heavy with clouds, and the air felt thick and oppressive. I saw a figure in the distance. A woman, standing motionless, her back to me. She wore a tattered dress, and her long hair blew wildly in the wind. Something about her felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. I called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she began to turn slowly toward me. I woke up before I could see her face. My heart was pounding, and I was drenched in sweat. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 3:32 a.m. Claire was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I tried to shake off the dream. It was probably just stress, I told myself. Work had been hectic, and the holidays always brought their own set of challenges. But as the day went on, the image of the woman lingered in the back of my mind, her presence like a shadow I couldn't escape. That evening, as we settled into the living room to watch a movie, I noticed the ornament again. It caught my eye more than the others, its shifting patterns mesmerizing. I couldn't explain why, but it unsettled me. "What's wrong?" Claire asked, following my gaze. I shook my head. "Nothing. Just that ornament. It's strange, isn't it?" She laughed softly. "You're overthinking." It's just an ornament. Maybe she was right. But that night, I dreamed again. This time, the field was gone. I was in a house, old and crumbling, with peeling wallpaper and creaking floors. The air was heavy with dust, and every step I took echoed unnaturally. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. Then, I heard a faint voice. A whisper, barely audible. It called my name. I followed the sound to a door at the end of a long hallway. It was slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. As I reached for the handle, the whispering stopped. I hesitated, a deep sense of dread rooting me in place. I pushed the door open and woke up gasping. Claire stirred beside me. "Another bad dream?" she asked groggily. I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, must be the holiday stress." But I knew it wasn't just stress. Something was wrong. The following days brought more dreams, each one more vivid and disturbing than the last. The woman appeared again, her face always just out of view. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the sense of being watched never left me. I began to notice other changes, too. The air in the living room felt colder, even with the heater running. The lights on the tree seemed to flicker when I walked past. And the ornament, it always seemed to catch my eye, its patterns shifting in ways that felt deliberate. Claire noticed my unease. "You've been distracted lately," she said one evening. "Are you sure everything's okay?" I wanted to tell her about the dreams, about the strange feeling that the ornament was somehow connected. But I didn't want to sound crazy. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." But the truth was, I wasn't fine. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The dreams didn't stop. Each night, they grew longer, more vivid, and increasingly disturbing. The woman with the tattered dress haunted me, her presence becoming more oppressive, more real. By the end of the week, I had stopped sleeping properly. Even Claire noticed. "You look exhausted," she said one morning as we sat at the kitchen table. Her voice was tinged with concern, but also a trace of frustration. "You're barely eating, barely sleeping. What's going on with you?" I hesitated, my spoon hovering over my bowl of cereal. I didn't want to tell her. She'd laugh it off, or worse, she'd think I was losing it. But the truth was clawing at me, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. "It's the ornament," I said finally. The words felt ridiculous even as they left my mouth. "Ever since we hung it on the tree, I've been having these dreams. Nightmares, really. And they're getting worse." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Nightmares? About what?" I told her everything. The field, the crumbling house, the woman who always stood just out of reach. The whispers that called my name. As I spoke, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something closer to fear. "Do you think it's stress?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it herself. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it feels connected to that thing. The ornament. Every time I look at it, it's like it's watching me." Claire frowned, glancing toward the living room where the tree stood. "Maybe we should take it down." The suggestion filled me with an inexplicable dread. "No," I said quickly, almost too quickly. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It's just an ornament. I'll be fine." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed that. That night, the dream was different. I wasn't in the field or the crumbling house. I was back in my own living room, standing in front of the Christmas tree. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the tree lights. The ornament hung in its usual spot, but something was wrong. Its surface, usually so delicate and intricate, now seemed cracked, jagged. And it was glowing. I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. The glow pulsed, faint whispers filling the room. They weren't calling my name this time. Instead, they were saying something else, a word I couldn't quite understand. I leaned in, straining to hear, and as I did, the ornament began to shift. The patterns on its surface moved faster and faster, until they formed a face. Her face. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my skin clammy with sweat. The clock read 3:06 a.m. I turned toward Claire, but she was fast asleep, her breathing soft and even. I wanted to wake her, to tell her about the dream, but what could I say? That the ornament had come alive? That it was trying to communicate with me? Instead, I got out of bed and went to the living room. The tree stood silently, its lights twinkling softly in the darkness. The ornament was exactly where I had left it, its surface as pristine as ever. But as I stared at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring back. The next day, I decided to do some digging. If the ornament had a history, I wanted to know what it was. I went to the antique shop where Mr. Hargrove claimed to have found it. The place was small and cluttered, with shelves overflowing with knickknacks and trinkets from every era. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. "Can I help you?" the shopkeeper asked, a thin, elderly woman with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. I pulled up a photo of the ornament on my phone and showed it to her. "Do you recognize this?" Mr. Hargrove said he bought it here. Her expression darkened immediately. "I remember that piece," she said, her voice low. "I sold it to him a few weeks ago. But I didn't want to." He insisted. "Why didn't you want to sell it?" I asked, my stomach tightening. She hesitated, glancing around the shop as if checking for eavesdroppers. "That ornament, it's not just glass. It's been passed around for decades. Maybe longer. No one keeps it for long. Bad things happen when they do." "What kind of bad things?" She shook her head. "Accidents. Fires. People disappearing. I don't know if it's cursed, or haunted, or what, but that thing brings trouble. You'd do well to get rid of it." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Where did it come from? Do you know?" She sighed. "The story goes that it was part of a collection made by a craftsman in the early 1900s. He worked alone, and his pieces were beautiful, but strange. People said he talked to them like they were alive. Then one day, he disappeared, and his workshop burned to the ground. The ornaments that survived, well, they've been turning up here and there ever since." I left the shop with more questions than answers. The idea of getting rid of the ornament seemed simple enough, but a part of me hesitated. What if the shopkeeper was right? What if it was more than just a decoration? And what if getting rid of it didn't stop whatever had already started? That evening, I told Claire everything. The dreams, the shopkeeper's warnings, the ornament's supposed history. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "Maybe we should throw it out," she said when I finished. "Or smash it." The thought filled me with an inexplicable dread. "No," I said. "Not yet. I need to understand what it is first. Why it's here. And if it's dangerous." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the ornament, or whatever force it carried, wasn't done with me yet. And deep down, I wasn't sure I was done with it either. I spent the next few days buried in research. The history of the ornament, if what the shopkeeper had said was true, was too strange to ignore. I scoured old newspaper archives, online forums about haunted antiques, and even reached out to a local historian. The more I uncovered, the more the threads of the story began to weave together into something horrifying. The ornament had surfaced repeatedly over the last century. It appeared in estate sales, antique shops, and sometimes mysteriously on people's doorsteps. Every time, it was tied to tragedy. A fire in 1932 that consumed an entire boarding house. A family disappearance in 1957, their home left eerily untouched. And most chillingly, an artist in 1984 who had painted images of a woman in tattered clothing, the same woman I'd seen in my dreams, before hanging himself in his studio. These weren't isolated events. The ornament, or whatever was attached to it, left a trail of destruction. But there was something else, too. Each account mentioned dreams. People who had owned the ornament described seeing things that weren't there, hearing whispers, and, eventually, being drawn to something they couldn't resist. Something dark. Claire grew increasingly uneasy as I shared what I'd learned. One evening, she confronted me as I sat at the dining table, surrounded by notes and printouts. "You're obsessed," she said, crossing her arms. "This thing, whatever it is, it's taking over your life. Maybe the shopkeeper was right. Maybe we should just get rid of it." I looked up at her, exhaustion and frustration boiling over. "And what if that doesn't work? What if throwing it out only makes it worse? And what if keeping it does?" She shot back. "We don't know what we're dealing with here, Michael. This isn't normal." She was right, of course. None of this was normal. But something about the ornament, something about the woman in my dreams, felt personal. Like I was connected to it in a way I couldn't explain. I couldn't just walk away. "Give me a little more time," I said finally. "I need to figure this out." Claire sighed, shaking her head. "Fine. But if things get worse, I'm taking it out of here myself." That night, the dream returned, more vivid than ever. I was back in the crumbling house, but this time, I wasn't alone. The woman was there, standing at the end of the hallway, her face obscured by shadows. She didn't move, but the air around her seemed to ripple, like heat rising off pavement. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills down my spine. Then she raised a hand and pointed to a door on my left. The same door I'd seen in a previous dream. It was slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But something pulled me forward. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the door. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking, and pushed it open. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat the ornament, glowing faintly. The patterns on its surface moved like living things, twisting and writhing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. As I stepped closer, the woman appeared behind me. I saw a reflection in the ornament surface. Her face, it was a blur of features, shifting and merging like a nightmare-given form. I turned to face her, and she spoke for the first time. "Remember." I woke with a start, gasping for air. My heart was pounding, and my skin was damp with sweat. The clock read 3:23 a.m. I sat up, my mind racing. What did she mean? Remember what? The following morning, I decided to confront Mr. Hargrove. He had given me the ornament, and whether he knew it or not, he was part of this. When I knocked on his door, it took a long time for him to answer. He looked friendlier than I remembered, his face pale and lined with worry. "Michael," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wondered when you'd come." His words unsettled me. "You knew, didn't you? About the ornament. About what it does." He nodded slowly, motioning for me to come inside. His house was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and something metallic. We sat in his cluttered living room, and he began to speak. "I found it years ago," he said, "at an estate sale. I didn't know what it was at first, but it didn't take long to figure out it wasn't normal. The dreams, the whispers, they started almost immediately. And the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Why didn't you get rid of it?" I asked. He looked down at his hands, his expression haunted. "I tried, but it always came back. No matter where I left it, no matter how far I threw it, it found its way home. So you gave it to me," I said, anger rising in my chest. He looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. "I thought, maybe you could break the cycle. Maybe you could figure out what it wants." I stood, my fists clenched. "You should have told me what I was getting into." "I'm sorry," he said softly. "But it's too late now. It's chosen you." His words chilled me to the core. Chosen me? For what? As I left his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The ornament was waiting for me at home, and I knew, without a doubt, that the woman would return in my dreams. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The ornament wasn't just an object, it was a force, a presence that had entangled itself with my life. Every moment I spent near it felt like I was being pulled into something far darker than I could comprehend. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. Claire noticed the shift in me. She was quieter now, watching from the sidelines as I slipped further into obsession. I could see the fear in her eyes, but she didn't push. Maybe she was waiting for me to come to my senses, or maybe she was too afraid of what I might say. The dreams continued. Each night, they grew longer and more vivid, the woman in tattered clothing becoming a constant presence. She didn't speak again, but her gestures, her expressions, blurred as they were, seemed to convey a sense of urgency. She was leading me somewhere, guiding me to what? I began to keep a journal, scribbling down every detail of the dreams as soon as I woke up. The house, the hallway, the room with the glowing ornament. It was always the same, but each time, the whispers grew louder, the patterns on the ornament more intricate. And the woman, she was getting closer. One night, I woke to the sound of the tree lights flickering. The living room was dark except for the faint, erratic glow of the ornament. I stared at it from the hallway, my heart pounding. It was glowing brighter than ever, the patterns on its surface twisting and shifting with a life of their own. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite my fear. As I reached out, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than ever. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were words, though I couldn't fully understand them. It was like hearing a conversation through a wall, muffled, indistinct, but undeniably there. "Michael?" Claire's voice startled me. I turned to see her standing at the edge of the hallway, her face pale. "What are you doing?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking. It's doing something." She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the ornament. "We need to get rid of it," she said firmly. "Tonight." For a moment, I considered agreeing. But then the whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as if they were pleading with me. "I can't," I said. "Not yet." "Michael." "It's showing me something," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "In the dreams. It's trying to tell me something important. If we destroy it now, we might never know what it is." Claire stared at me, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. Finally, she turned and walked away without another word. The next day, I decided to go back to the antique shop. The shopkeeper had known something about the ornament's history, but I hadn't asked the right questions. Maybe there was more she hadn't told me. When I arrived, the shop was closed. A for sale sign hung crookedly in the window, and the interior was dark. I peered through the glass, but the shelves were empty, the place abandoned. My stomach sank. Had she left because of the ornament? Or was this just another strange coincidence? As I turned to leave, I noticed an envelope taped to the door. My name was scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. I tore it open, pulling out a single piece of paper. The message was short. "You'll find the answers where it began." Where it began. The words echoed in my mind as I drove home. Was it referring to the dreams? The house with the peeling wallpaper and creaking floors? If so, how could I find a place that only existed in my mind? That night, the dream returned, but it was different. The house was clearer, more real, as if I were truly there. I could feel the chill in the air, smell the faint scent of mildew and decay. The woman was waiting for me at the end of the hallway, her figure shrouded in shadows. This time, she didn't point to the door. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing a staircase leading downward. I hesitated, but the whispers pushed me forward, urging me to descend. The stairs were narrow and steep, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom was another door, its surface cracked and weathered. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. Inside was a small room, lit by a faint, pulsating glow. The ornament sat on a pedestal in the center, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. But there was something else in the room, something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the corner, its back to me. It was tall and thin, its frame unnaturally elongated. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as I stepped closer. The figure began to turn, its movements slow and deliberate. I woke up gasping, my heart racing. The clock read 3:15 a.m. I sat up, struggling to catch my breath. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that I half expected to find myself still in that room. And then I heard it. A faint sound, coming from the living room. It was the tree lights, flickering again. But this time, there was something else. A shadow moved across the hallway, just out of sight. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept toward the living room. The ornament was glowing again, its patterns moving faster than ever. The whispers filled the room, almost deafening now. And then I saw it. The woman from my dreams was standing by the tree, her face still obscured by shadows. She raised a hand, pointing toward the ornament. Her voice cut through the whispers, clear and commanding. Remember. The room went dark. The house was silent, but the echoes of her voice lingered in my mind. Remember, she had said, and the word pulsed through me like a command. I sat in the living room, the flashlight trembling in my hand, the ornament's glow now faint and steady. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered, like a shadow etched into the corners of the room. Claire found me sitting on the floor when she woke up. The sunlight streaming through the windows made the events of the night before feel distant and surreal. But the unease remained, and I couldn't ignore it. "Michael," she said softly, crouching beside me. "What happened?" I shook my head, unable to meet her gaze. "She was here," I said finally. "The woman from the dreams. She was standing right there." I pointed to the spot beside the tree. Claire's face paled. "Michael, this has to stop. Whatever's happening, it's not safe. We need to get rid of that thing. Now." "I can't," I whispered. "It's not just an ornament. It's showing me something I need to remember." Her frustration was evident, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she stood and began pacing the room, her arms crossed tightly. "Then we need help," she said after a moment. "Someone who knows about this kind of stuff. A historian, a paranormal investigator, I don't know." I hesitated, the idea of involving someone else filling me with unease. But she was right. I couldn't keep doing this alone. "Fine," I said. "I'll find someone." Later that day, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in folklore and local legends. Dr. Evelyn Hart was well known in the area for her research into strange artifacts and forgotten histories. She agreed to meet me at her office the following morning. Her office was in an old brick building downtown, the kind of place that felt steeped in history. Shelves lined the walls, overflowing with books, artifacts, and framed photographs. Dr. Hart was a tall woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She listened intently as I recounted the story of the ornament, the dreams, and the woman. "You said the ornament was connected to a craftsman from the early 20th century, she asked, scribbling notes in a leather-bound journal. I nodded. "At least, that's what I was told. The shopkeeper said he disappeared, and his workshop burned down." Dr. Hart tapped her pen against the journal thoughtfully. "There's a legend about a craftsman who worked with glass and metal around that time. They say he created pieces so beautiful, they seemed almost alive. But the stories also claim he was unusual, obsessed with his work, reclusive. Some even said he practiced rituals while he crafted." "Rituals?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "There are whispers that he believed his creations could trap energy. Spirits, memories, emotions. Whatever he was doing, it said he vanished without a trace, and his pieces scattered. Do you think the ornament could be one of his?" Dr. Hart leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "It's possible. If it is, it's more than just an artifact. It's a conduit. And if it's showing you things in your dreams, it might be trying to tell you something. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. But what? What does it want me to remember? She shook her head. That, I can't say. But if you want answers, you'll need to follow where it leads. Just be careful. These things, they don't always reveal the truth in ways we expect. That night, I stared at the ornament, its glow faint and steady. Dr. Hart's words echoed in my mind. A conduit. A vessel for energy, for memories. I wondered what kind of memory could carry so much weight, so much darkness. When I finally drifted to sleep, the dream came quickly. I was back in the crumbling house, the hallway stretching out before me. The woman stood at the far end, her form clearer now. I could make out the edges of her face, her hands, the torn fabric of her dress. She raised her arm, pointing once again to the staircase. I descended without hesitation this time, the whispers guiding me downward. The air grew colder, heavier, as I reached the bottom. The door was there, just as it had been before. But this time, when I opened it, the room was different. The ornament was still there, glowing on the pedestal. But the shadows on the walls had grown darker, deeper. They writhed and twisted like living things, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice. Remember. The voice wasn't hers this time. It was a man's voice, deep and resonant. And it was familiar. I stepped closer to the ornament, the light from its surface casting strange patterns on my skin. As I reached out to touch it, the shadows surged forward, enveloping me. I felt cold, weightless, as if I were falling into darkness. When I woke, I was sitting upright in bed, my heart pounding. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Claire was beside me, still asleep, her face peaceful. But I felt anything but peaceful. The dream had been too vivid, too real. And the voice. I couldn't shake the feeling that I knew it. That it belonged to someone I should remember. The next morning, I told Claire about the dream, about Dr. Hart's theory. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. You're going back there, aren't you? She asked finally. I nodded. I have to. Whatever this is, it's not going to stop until I figure it out. Then I'm coming with you, she said firmly. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't going to back down. And maybe, deep down, I didn't want to face it alone. All right, I said. We'll go together. As we prepared to confront whatever the ornament was leading us to, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers would come at a price. And I wasn't sure either of us was ready to pay it. The air was heavy with anticipation as Claire and I prepared to descend into whatever truth the ornament held. It wasn't just about the dreams anymore, or even the woman in the tattered dress. The voice I'd heard in the last vision lingered in my mind. It was familiar, intimate, and unsettling in ways I couldn't yet explain. Claire packed a flashlight and a sturdy kitchen knife, her expression set with grim determination. I don't know what we're walking into, she said, but I'm not going unprepared. I didn't argue. The events of the last few weeks had shown me how unprepared I truly was. Whatever awaited us, I could only hope we were ready. We sat in silence for a while, the ornament's glow casting shifting patterns across the walls. The whispers had been faint all evening, like a distant chorus just beyond hearing. But as midnight approached, they grew louder, more insistent. The air felt charged, alive with an energy that set my nerves on edge. It's time, I said finally, standing. Claire followed, her grip on the flashlight firm. Together, we approached the tree. The ornament's light intensified, pulsing in rhythm with the whispers. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the world shifted. The room dissolved into darkness, and the whispers roared in my ears. When the light returned, Claire and I were no longer in our home. We stood in the hallway from my dreams, the peeling wallpaper and creaking floors exactly as I'd seen them. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Claire's flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing details I'd only glimpsed before, a cracked picture frame hanging askew, a trail of faint, muddy footprints leading further into the house. This is it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is the place." Claire glanced around, her face pale but composed. "Where do we go?" I gestured toward the end of the hallway, where the woman had always stood in my dreams. The door to the staircase was ajar, the faint glow of the ornament emanating from below. The whispers seemed to converge there, their tone urgent and pleading. "Downstairs," I said, leading the way. The staircase was steep and narrow, the wood groaning under our weight. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers louder. By the time we reached the bottom, they were deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining. The room was just as I'd seen it, small, dimly lit, with the ornament resting on a pedestal in the center. Shadows writhed on the walls, their movements unnatural and hypnotic. But now there was something else. A figure stood beside the pedestal, its back to us. It was the woman. Her form was clearer than ever, her tattered dress fluttering in an invisible breeze. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her head tilted slightly as if listening to the whispers. She didn't turn as we entered, but the air seemed to shift, acknowledging our presence. "What do we do?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the woman turned. Her face, it wasn't blurred anymore. It was pale, hollow, her eyes sunken and her expression devoid of emotion. But there was something familiar about her, something that made my breath catch. "Do you know her?" Claire asked, noticing my reaction. I shook my head, but the truth was clawing its way to the surface. The woman raised a hand, pointing to the ornament on the pedestal. Her lips moved, and though her voice was drowned out by the whispers, I understood her message. "Take it." I hesitated, my hands shaking. "What happens if I do?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. The whispers faltered for a moment, as if holding their breath. The woman's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes, sorrow. "Michael," Claire said, her tone urgent. "Don't." But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward, my hand reaching for the ornament. The moment I touched it, the room erupted in light and sound. The whispers became a single voice, deep and resonant, filling my mind with a single word. "Remember." Images flooded my mind, disjointed and overwhelming. I saw the craftsman in his workshop, his hands moving with unnatural speed as he shaped glass and metal. I saw the woman, younger and alive, watching him with a mix of admiration and fear. And I saw myself, as a child, standing in the doorway of that same workshop. The voice spoke again, this time with clarity. "You were there." I fell to my knees, the weight of the revelation crushing me. The woman stepped closer, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. "You have to finish it," she said, her voice soft and mournful. "Only then can we rest." "Finish what?" I demanded, my voice breaking. She gestured to the ornament. "It's incomplete. The memory, the pain, it's trapped. Free it." Claire knelt beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "Michael, what is she talking about?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was too much to process. But as I looked at the ornament, its glow pulsing in time with the whispers, I knew what I had to do. "Help me," I said to Claire, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. Together, we lifted the ornament from the pedestal. The room shuddered, the shadows writhing violently. The whispers rose to a crescendo, then fell silent as the light from the ornament consumed everything. And then there was nothing but darkness. The darkness felt endless, a void that swallowed sound, light, and even thought. I couldn't feel Claire's hand on my shoulder anymore, couldn't hear her breathing beside me. For a moment, I feared I was alone, lost in whatever space the ornament had pulled us into. But then, faintly, a light began to glow in the distance, soft and golden, like the first rays of dawn breaking over horizon. "Michael," Claire's voice came, distant but steady. "Where are we?" "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice trembling. "But we have to keep moving." The glow grew brighter as we approached, revealing a space that seemed both infinite and enclosed. The walls were indistinct, shimmering like water, and the ground beneath our feet felt solid but gave slightly, as if it were alive. In the center of the space stood a figure, waiting. It was the craftsman. His face was worn and lined with age, his eyes holding a sadness that felt ancient. He stood beside a workbench, his hands resting on its surface. The ornament, or what remained of it, was there, its light flickering weakly. Surrounding him were fragments of glass and metal, scattered like the remnants of a shattered life. "You came," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I've been waiting." Claire gripped my arm tightly. "Michael, who is this?" "I think he's the craftsman," I said, though the certainty in my voice surprised even me. "The one who made the ornament." The craftsman's gaze shifted to Claire, then back to me. "You remember now," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Don't you?" I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the memories were already surfacing. Fractured images, like shards of broken glass, pieced themselves together in my mind. The workshop, the tools, the whispers. I'd been there before, as a child, watching as he worked. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The craftsman stepped closer, his presence both comforting and oppressive. "Because you are the only one who can finish what I started." He gestured to the workbench, where the fragments of the ornament lay scattered. "It was never complete," he said. "The energy, the memory, it's trapped. And until it is freed, the cycle will continue." "What cycle?" Claire demanded, stepping forward. "What does any of this mean?" The craftsman's expression softened. "Pain," he said simply. "Loss. Despair. These are the threads that bind the ornament. Every owner has added their own, woven into its core. But it was never meant to hold so much. It's collapsing under its own weight. And what happens if we don't fix it?" I asked. The craftsman's gaze darkened. "Then the pain will spread, like a fracture through glass. It will consume everyone it touches." Claire turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Michael, we can't let that happen." I nodded, though my hands shook as I reached for the workbench. The fragments of the ornament seemed to hum under my touch, resonating with a frequency that sent chills through me. "What do I have to do?" The craftsman placed his hands over mine, guiding them. "You must weave the threads together," he said. "But you must also give something of yourself. A memory, a piece of your soul. Only then can the ornament be whole." The weight of his words sank into me. "What happens to me if I do?" "You'll survive," he said. "But you will never be the same." The process was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The craftsman's hands guided mine, shaping the fragments into a new form. The whispers grew louder, each one carrying a story, a memory, a life. I felt them passing through me, their pain and sorrow mingling with my own. Claire watched in silence, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her presence grounded me, kept me from slipping into the void of memories that threatened to overwhelm me. The ornament began to take shape, its glow steady and strong. But I could feel it drawing something from me, pulling at the edges of my mind. When it was finished, the craftsman stepped back, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "It is done," he said. "The pain is contained. The cycle is broken." I looked at the ornament, now whole and gleaming with a light that felt warm and soothing. But I also felt a hollowness within me, as if a part of myself had been taken. "What happens now?" I asked. The craftsman smiled faintly. "Now, you let it go." He gestured to the space around us, which began to shift and dissolve. The workshop faded, replaced by the familiar walls of our living room. Claire and I stood by the tree, the ornament resting in my hands. "What do we do with it?" Claire asked. I thought of the pain it had caused, the lives it had touched. And I thought of the peace it could bring now that it was whole. "We'll find a place for it," I said. "Somewhere safe, where it can't hurt anyone again." She nodded, her hand slipping into mine. Together, we placed the ornament back on the tree, its light casting soft, golden patterns across the room. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet. The days that followed felt lighter, as though the house itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Claire and I moved through the motions of daily life, but a quiet understanding lingered between us. The ornament, now complete, sat on the tree, its golden light steady and serene. Whatever darkness had once surrounded it seemed to have dissipated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished remained. The memories the ornament had drawn from me were scattered, incomplete fragments of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. On Christmas Eve, as the snow fell softly outside, I sat in the living room, staring at the ornament. The tree lights blinked in rhythm, casting a warm glow over the room. Claire was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared cocoa. The whispers were gone, but the weight of the ornament's history remained. When Claire joined me, she set a mug in front of me and sat on the couch, her legs curled beneath her. "It feels different now," she said, her gaze fixed on the tree. "Like it's at peace." I nodded, but I still don't know what I gave up to fix it. There's something missing. She reached for my hand, her touch grounding me. Maybe it's better not to know. Maybe that's the point. I wanted to agree, but the hollowness inside me wouldn't let me. That night, I dreamed again. But this time, it wasn't the crumbling house or the woman in the tattered dress. I was standing in a field blanketed with snow, the moonlight illuminating the world in silver. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of my footsteps as I walked. In the distance, a figure stood, waiting. It was the craftsman, his silhouette sharp against the pale landscape. As I approached, he raised a hand in greeting. "You did well," he said, his voice softer now, almost kind. "The pain has been contained. The memories, the lives, they're safe. But what about me?" I asked, my voice echoing in the stillness. "What did I give up?" The craftsman's expression grew somber. "A piece of yourself," he said. "A memory, a fragment of your soul. It was necessary to complete the work. But what you lost, it's something you can live without." I frowned, the weight of his words settling over me. Will I ever know what it was? He shook his head. "Perhaps. Or perhaps not. But remember this, what you gave was freely given, and what you have gained is peace." The field began to blur, the edges of the dream dissolving. The craftsman's voice lingered as the light faded. "Take care of it. And take care of yourself." I woke with the first light of dawn, the dream still vivid in my mind. Claire stirred beside me, her hand reaching for mine. "Are you okay?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "Yeah, I think I am." We spent the morning quietly, opening gifts and sipping coffee by the fire. The ornament remained on the tree, its light steady and warm. It no longer felt like a burden or a threat. It felt like a part of our home, a silent reminder of what we'd faced together. As the day went on, the heaviness in my chest began to lift. The emptiness I'd felt since finishing the ornament was still there, but it was less oppressive, more like a scar than a wound. I didn't know if the memories would ever return, but I was starting to accept that maybe they didn't need to. That evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Claire and I stood by the tree, admiring the way the lights danced on the walls. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "Do you think it's over?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at the ornament, its light steady and unyielding. "I think so," I said. "But even if it isn't, we'll face it together." She smiled, leaning into me. Together. And as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope.